When the powerful CEO, Richard Thompson, summarily fires a humble cleaning lady for a crime she did not commit, he believes he is merely removing another obstacle in his relentless rise to the top. But fate has other plans. When the woman's son shows up in his office holding a hospital bracelet with a devastating message, "Find Daddy," Richard's world instantly crumbles. In seconds, the man who built an empire on coldness and calculation discovers that he has just destroyed his own family. Now, as he struggles with the consequences of his cruel choices, one question remains: are some mistakes too big to be forgiven, or can a child's love be strong enough to redeem even the hardest heart?
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
Richard Thompson's alarm clock never needed to ring. At 45, his biological clock worked with the Swiss precision of a man who had turned every second into a dollar. At 5:30 in the morning, his eyes opened in the master bedroom of his mansion in Palo Alto, a $20 million estate that rose like a modern temple to success. The glass ceiling above his king-size bed revealed the still dark California sky, dotted with the last stars resisting the dawn. Richard remained motionless for a few moments, his muscles tense even at rest, as if his body were a machine programmed to always stay alert. The silence in the house was absolute. Not even the ticking of a clock dared to disturb the calculated peace of his sanctuary. He rose with precise movements, his bare feet touching the heated Italian marble that covered the entire floor. The house responded to his steps with motion sensors that lit up LED lights at the perfect temperature, neither too cold nor too warm. Everything in his life had been calibrated to perfection, including the intensity of the morning light. The main bathroom was a work of art in Carrara marble, with a sculpted bathtub that had cost more than an average house in San Jose. Richard looked at himself in the full-length mirror, his gray eyes analyzing every detail like a general inspecting troops. At 45, he kept his physique chiseled through daily sessions with his personal trainer. Every wrinkle around his eyes had been strategically treated by Beverly Hills dermatologists. His appearance was his foremost business asset. The steam shower enveloped his body as he mentally planned the day's agenda. Thompson and Associates, his technology company, had become a powerhouse in Silicon Valley through aggressive acquisitions and decisions others would consider ruthless. Richard preferred the term efficient. Feelings were luxuries men like him could not afford. He dressed with the precision of a sacred ritual, a $3,000 Italian suit tailored especially for his body, Egyptian silk shirt, a branded tie few would recognize but that whispered status to those who mattered. His English leather shoes had been polished by the butler the night before, a 60-year-old man who had worked for him for a decade and with whom Richard exchanged at most 10 words a week. The kitchen of his mansion looked like it had come out of an architecture magazine. Black quartz countertops, German appliances costing more than luxury cars, and a panoramic view of the Japanese garden that a Kyoto landscaper had created exclusively for him. Richard didn't cook. The Sub-Zero refrigerator was always stocked by his private chef, but he rarely ate at home. Meals were business opportunities, not moments of pleasure. He took only an espresso from an Italian machine that had cost $15,000, savoring the dark liquid while watching the sunrise gild the distant mountains. For a brief moment, something that could be called melancholy passed through his gray eyes. The house was perfect, but echoed with a silence that no amount of money could fill. His phone she kept 3 cell phones for different aspects of his business. Life began vibrating simultaneously on the marble countertop. The world was waking up, along with the opportunities and threats that Richard needed to manage with an iron fist. He walked to the underground garage, a private showroom that housed his car collection. A red Ferrari 488 GTB, a silver Lamborghini Huracan, a black Porsche 911 Turbo S, and his Mercedes-AMG GT for special occasions. But this morning, as on most mornings, he chose the black Tesla, Mo 1 Do S. Not for economy. Richard Thompson never thought about economizing, but because Tesla represented the future, and he always made sure to be ahead of the future. The car's interior enveloped him in aromatic leather and cutting-edge technology. As the vehicle glided silently through the still empty streets of Palo Alto, Richard mentally reviewed his strategy for the day. 2 acquisitions in negotiation, a meeting with Japanese investors, and the firing of a vice president who had shown signs of moral weakness, a euphemism Richard used to describe anyone who placed scruples above results. His neighbors' mansions paraded past the window like postcards of a life he had won through sacrifices few men would have the courage to make. Marriage? Destroyed at 32 when his then-wife discovered he had lied about family investments to finance his first major acquisition. Children? There had never been time, and now it was too late to learn to be a father. Friends? Relationships were strategic partnerships or obstacles to be removed. The Tesla crossed the perfectly planned streets of Silicon Valley, passing cafes where young entrepreneurs dreamed of becoming the next Richard Thompson. They had no idea of the true price of success, not just the money, but the parts of the soul that had to be negotiated on the path to the top. His company rose like a cathedral of glass and steel in the heart of Palo Alto. Thompson and Associates occupied 16 floors of a building Richard had purchased entirely when the company had grown beyond his most optimistic projections. The executive parking in the basement was his exclusive Domain 5 spaces that remained eternally empty, except for his. Richard turned off the engine and sat for a moment, absorbing the silence before the daily storm. His fingers drummed on the leather steering wheel, a nervous habit he had developed in recent years. Sometimes, in rare moments like this, a small voice in his mind whispered questions he quickly suppressed. Was it worth it? The empire he had built on the ruins of human relationships was truly a triumph or a golden prison? But philosophical questions were luxuries Richard Thompson could not afford. He got out of the car, adjusted his shirt cuffs, and walked toward the private elevators. Another day of ruthless decisions awaited him, and he would face each one with a calculated coldness that had made him the most feared and respected man in Silicon Valley. The gates of his empire were open. It was time to reign. Maria Rodriguez always arrived at work 45 minutes before her official shift started. At 34 years old, she had learned that life did not offer second chances to people like her, an immigrant, single mother, with only the English she had picked up on the streets of San Jose and in the silent hallways of the offices she cleaned. That Tuesday morning, her hands trembled slightly as she swiped her ID card through the reader at the service entrance of the Thompson & Associates building. The nervousness did not come from the morning chill of California, but from the constant worry she carried in her chest like a stone. Her 12-year-old daughter, Sophia, had woken up with a fever during the night, and Maria had to leave her with the elderly neighbor, Mrs. Carmen, promising to be back before 2 in the afternoon to take her to the doctor. The navy blue uniform she wore was immaculate, washed and ironed the night before in her small apartment laundry. Maria made sure to maintain a professional appearance, even knowing that most executives passing through the hallways barely noticed her existence. She was invisible, and she had learned that invisibility was both a protection and a curse. Her footsteps echoed softly on the marble lobby floor as she headed to the service elevator. The building was still asleep in its corporate quietness. Only the low hum of the air conditioning and the gentle glow of emergency lights breaking the silence. Maria liked these moments before the daily storm when she could work in peace, unhurried, making sure every detail was perfect. The cleaning cart awaited her on the 15th floor, exactly where she had left it the night before. Cleaning products organized by category. Cloths folded with military precision. A vacuum cleaner she herself had asked the supervisor to replace last year when the previous one started making too much noise. Maria treated her work tools with the respect of a craftsman. They were her livelihood guarantee, her bridge to a better future for Sophia. She started with the executive restrooms, as she always did. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Each surface received individual attention. Each mirror shone without a single mark. Maria had developed a simple philosophy over the 5 years working in this building. If she did her job well, was punctual and respectful, kept her head down and her mouth shut, perhaps she could build a stable life for herself and Sophia. Mr. Thompson's office was always her last challenge of the morning. An executive suite on the 16th floor that took up more space than her entire apartment. Glass walls offered a panoramic view of Silicon Valley, while Brazilian mahogany furniture and contemporary art proclaimed power and success. Maria always felt a mix of admiration and discomfort entering that space. It was like stepping into a world she would never belong to. The night before, she had cleaned the office with her usual care. Vacuumed the Persian rugs, polished the conference table that cost more than 2 years of her salary, arranged the leather chairs with geometric precision. She clearly remembered seeing the silver laptop on Mr. Thompson's desk, a MacBook Pro she knew cost nearly $3,000 because she had looked up the price online, dreaming that one day she could buy a decent computer for Sophia to do her schoolwork. Now, as she pushed her cart down the executive corridor, Maria felt an inexplicable anxiety growing in her chest. Maybe it was worry about Sophia, or maybe it was the intuition developed by years of working silently and observing the waves of tension that occasionally swept through the corporate offices. Richard Thompson arrived at his office at 7:45 in the morning, as he did every day. His steps were firm and determined on the marble, the sound of his Italian shoes echoing with authority through the still semi-empty hallways. The first thing he did, as always, was check his laptop on the desk. The desk was empty. For a moment, Richard remained still, his gray eyes scanning the polished mahogany surface as if the computer might materialize through the force of his will. His jaw tensed, a vein throbbing in his temple as the reality of the situation crystallized in his mind. "Impossible," he muttered to himself, roughly opening the desk drawers. He checked under the desk, behind the chairs, even in the adjacent private bathroom. Nothing. The anger that started as a spark in his chest quickly turned into a blaze. Richard Thompson did not lose things. There was no room in his meticulously organized life for disorder or chance. Someone had entered his private sanctuary and violated his personal security. He pressed the intercom button hard enough to make the device squeak. "Jennifer, my office. Now." His executive assistant, an efficient woman in her 40s who had learned to read Richard's moods like a meteorologist reads storms, appeared in less than 2 minutes. Her hands held a tablet and a cup of coffee, but both trembled slightly when she saw the expression on her boss's face. "My laptop is gone," Richard said, his voice controlled but loaded with cold fury. "I want to know who accessed this office in the last 24 hours. Jennifer quickly checked her electronic schedule, her fingers flying over the tablet screen. "Yesterday, you had a meeting with the Japanese until 6 in the evening. After that, only just the night cleaning crew, Mr. Thompson." "Names," Richard ordered, his eyes narrowing. "The team is supervised by Mrs. Patricia Williams, but the one who cleans your office specifically is Maria Rodriguez. She's worked here 5 years, never had any complaints." Richard didn't let Jennifer finish. "Call security. I want that woman here immediately. Mr. Thompson, perhaps we should first check if the laptop wasn't simply—" The look Richard gave his assistant made the words die in her throat. Jennifer nodded quickly and left the office, her hands trembling as she dialed security.
Jennifer ended the call with security, and a few minutes later, Maria was led to the office on the 16th floor, but this time, the silence was thick with tension. When the glass door opened, Maria stepped in determined, though her heart threatened to burst from her chest. The office was empty, the laptop wasn't there, and the only sound was the echo of her own footsteps. "Mr. Thompson," Maria began, her voice firm but controlled, "I know my job is just to clean, but I'm human. I was so nervous this morning because I trust my honesty." Richard remained expressionless, eyes fixed on her, hands clenched at his sides. The silence stretched until he finally spoke, his voice tense. "The cameras, the records, show nothing." The truth both terrified and relieved Maria. There was no concrete evidence, just an empty accusation. She took a deep breath, every word now had to carry weight. "I didn't take the laptop. I'm a model employee. And if it's not here, maybe there isn't a crime, just someone looking for someone to blame." Outside, the security team gathered hesitantly. Jennifer entered beside Richard and placed a hand on his shoulder. "There's a preliminary report, Richard. There was unauthorized entry through another floor. Maybe that's it." Richard's eyes widened, suspicious. Maria felt the weight of uncertainty. Maybe she was free, but moral judgment remained. The door quietly closed behind them, and the mood shifted now. There were more questions than answers, and Maria realized her ordeal might not end there. But the first curtain of accusations had, at least for now, fallen.
Bus number 22 rattled over the potholes on the road leading to East San Jose, each jolt making Maria feel as if her world was collapsing a little more. Her hands still trembled Had been 3 hours since she was escorted out of the Thompson and Associates building, but the humiliation still burned on her skin like a fresh wound. Through the bus's foggy window, Maria watched the landscapes gradually change. The immaculate mansions and perfect lawns of Palo Alto gave way to modest apartments, corner stores with signs in Spanish, and streets where older cars jostled for space with food trucks. This was her world of parallel universe to the executives she had silently served for 5 long years. Her eyes filled with tears as she thought of Dylan waiting for her at home. How would she explain to a 7-year-old boy that his mother had lost her job for something she had never done? How could she look into the eyes of that brave child and confess that maybe she wouldn't be able to pay for the medications that kept his leukemia in check? Maria's apartment was on the 2nd floor of a faded brick building on Tully Road. It wasn't much: 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen barely big enough for a table, a bathroom with cracked tiles she had tried to fix with spackle. But it was home, and for 5 years it had been enough because it represented stability and hope. Now, climbing the concrete steps leading to her door, Maria felt as if she were walking toward the end of everything she had built. The key turned in the lock with the same familiar creak as always, but today the sound seemed grim, like an omen. Maria pushed open the door and was immediately enveloped by the comforting scent of homey, a mix of the vanilla candles she bought at the Mexican market and the cumin spice that always lingered in her small kitchen. "Mommy?" Dylan's voice came from the bedroom, weak but full of expectation. "You came home early today." Maria closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to try to control the emotions threatening to overflow. She set her bag on the coffee tabla second-hand piece she had found on clearance and lovingly restored and walked toward her son's room. Dylan lay on his bed, surrounded by coloring books and a few simple toys. Even amid chemotherapy that had stolen his brown hair and left his skin pale as porcelain, he still wore the smile that broke Maria's heart between love and pain. The boy's dark eyes, so much like hers, lit up when he saw her. "How was work today, Mommy?" Dylan asked, closing the coloring book held in his small, thin hands. "You look sad. Are you okay?" Maria sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking slightly under her weight. How could she explain to a 7-year-old the cruelty of a world where people are judged without evidence? How could she share the weight of the injustice that had fallen upon them like an avalanche? "Mijo," she began, using the affectionate nickname that always made Dylan smile. "Mommy needs to talk to you about something important." Dylan's eyes widened slightly. Even at 7 years old, a child who had spent months going in and out of hospitals developed an unusual sensitivity to sense when adults were about to share difficult news. Today, Mommy lost her job," Maria said, her voice breaking slightly on the words. She reached out to stroke her son's pale face, her fingers trembling against the silky skin. "My boss said I did something I didn't do, and now I can't work there anymore." Dylan frowned, processing the information with the seriousness of a child forced to mature too soon. "But you always told me that when someone accuses you of something you didn't do, you have to tell the truth. Didn't you tell him the truth?" Silent tears began to run down Maria's face. "I tried, Mijo. I tried so hard. But sometimes people don't want to hear the truth. Sometimes they've already decided what they want to believe." The boy was quiet for a moment, his small eyes studying his mother's face with an intensity no one his age should have. Then, slowly, he sat up on the bed and stretched his thin arms toward her. "Come here, Mommy. You need a hug." Maria collapsed into her son's arms, and for a few moments the roles reversed. It was Dylan who comforted her, murmuring soft words in her ear as she cried against his small shoulder. The world seemed to have gone mad when a sick child had to be strong to console his adult mother. "Don't cry, Mommy," Dylan whispered, his little hands stroking Maria's dark hair. "You always find a way. Remember when I was really sick last year, and you said we would fight together? And look, I'm here. I'm getting better." But Maria knew something Dylan hadn't yet fully understood. On the boy's bedside table, partially hidden under a storybook, were the latest medical bills from Stanford Children's Hospital, numbers that danced before her eyes like demons whenever she tried to sleep. $3,000 for the last chemotherapy cycle, $1,800 for monthly blood tests, another $2,000 for pediatric oncologist appointments. With her salary from Thompson and Associates, Maria managed to pay these bills through a payment plan that stretched her budget to the limit but still worked. Without the job, without the $97 she received every 2 weeks after deductions, the financial house of cards she had built would collapse in a matter of weeks. Dylan's next chemotherapy cycle was scheduled for the coming Monday. 6 days. Maria had exactly 6 days to find a solution, or she would have to cancel the treatment that kept her son alive. "Dylan," she said, pulling back slightly to look into the boy's eyes, "Mommy wants you to know that no matter what happens, I will take care of you. Always. It might seem scary now, but I promise we will get through this together." Dylan nodded with the premature wisdom of a child who had faced his own mortality. "I know, Mammy, I'm not scared. I have you." That night, after Dylan fell asleep exhausted from treatment, Maria sat at the kitchen table with all the bills spread out before her.
The fluorescent light flickered above the kitchen table as if it were about to give out too. Maria squinted, trying to focus on the bills scattered in front of her. Each envelope was a cruel reminder of what she was about to lose: her home, Dylan's treatment, her hope. She ran the numbers for the third time, scribbling on an already crumpled sheet. But the result didn't change. The rent combined with medical bills was more than any reasonable alternative she could imagine. Selling the old car wouldn't cover even a third of what she needed. Taking a loan? From whom? She was alone. Maria's gaze fell on the framed photo of Dylan on the windowsill. He was 5 years old, wearing the superhero cape she had sewn herself. His smile was the same as it was now, despite the weight of his illness. She gently traced the frame with her fingers. "You're my strength, baby," she whispered. That night, Maria slept, sitting at the table, her head resting on the papers, while the cartoon played softly in the next room. The distant sound of children's laughter on television contrasted with the raw pain of a mother dreaming of a miracle, or at least a chance to fight. And deep in her mind, an idea began to take shape, uncomfortable and unavoidable. She would have to confront Richard Thompson, not as an employee, but as a mother. The truth needed to be heard, by him, by the world, and by Dylan.
The Thursday morning sun shone mercilessly on the sidewalks of Palo Alto, but Maria felt as if she were walking through a cold fog. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the small hand of Dylan, who walked beside her with determined steps despite the weakness that chemotherapy treatment left on his frail body. They had left home at 6 in the morning, after a night in which Maria barely managed to close her eyes. The medical bills remained scattered over the kitchen table like a silent accusation, the red numbers burning in her memory even now, under the golden light of California. 2 days had passed since her humiliating dismissal, and each passing hour made the brutal reality clearer. She needed that job back, or she would lose much more than her dignity. "Mommy, are you sure he will listen to us?" Dylan asked, his voice small but full of a courage that broke Maria's heart. He wore his favorite Spider-Man t-shirt, now too big for his weakened body, and carried a small backpack that Maria had packed with snacks and medicine, in case the walk took longer than planned. "I have to believe so, honey," Maria replied, gently squeezing her son's hand. "Sometimes people just need to see the truth with their own eyes to understand." Dylan nodded solemnly, as if he were an adult discussing business strategies. His dark eyes, so much like Maria's, observed the world around him, with that peculiar intensity of children who were forced to grow up too soon. In his free hand, he constantly rolled his hospital ID bracelet, a white plastic piece with medical information that had become his lucky charm. "You know," Dylan said after they had walked a few blocks in silence, "I've been thinking about my dad lately." Maria felt her heart stop for a moment. During Dylan's 7 years of life, she had skillfully navigated this topic whenever he brought it up, but the distress of recent days had lowered her emotional defenses. "What have you been thinking about him, honey?" she asked softly, preparing herself internally for a conversation she always feared having to face. "Well," Dylan said, his voice taking on that thoughtful tone he used when processing complex ideas, "you always said he was an important man who couldn't stay with us. Sometimes I wonder if he knew I'm sick, maybe he would come help us." Maria felt tears burn her eyes, but forced herself to keep her voice steady. The truth about Dylan's father was much more painful and complicated than any child should have to bear. How could she explain that she had met Richard Thompson during a corporate conference where she worked serving canapes? How to confess that one night of passion, when he made her feel special, desired, important, resulted in Dylan. But when she tried to tell him about the pregnancy, he changed his phone number and instructed his lawyers not to accept any contact from her. "Dylan," she said carefully, stopping for a moment on the sidewalk to kneel to the boy's eye level. "Your dad doesn't know about you because sometimes in life, people take different paths and no longer meet. It's not because you aren't wonderful or don't deserve to be loved. It's because some people don't know how to love the way you deserve." Dylan studied his mother's face with that precocious wisdom of children who faced hardships. Slowly, he nodded and gently touched Maria's cheek with his little hand. "It's okay, Mommy. I have you and you have me. We are family enough for anything." The simplicity and purity of those words made Maria hug her son right there on the sidewalk, not caring about the curious looks from passers-by. How had she raised such an extraordinary child? How did Dylan manage to find hope and love even amid so much uncertainty? "Besides," Dylan continued when they pulled apart from the hug, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone, "I have this." He raised the hospital bracelet, making it swing in the sunlight. "Dr. Martinez said that as long as I wear this, it means I'm fighting and that I'm stronger than anything bad that tries to get me. It's my superhero armor." Maria smiled through her tears. Dr. Elena Martinez, Dylan's pediatric oncologist at Stanford Children's Hospital, had become more than a doctor. She was a source of hope and strength for both Dylan and Maria. She was the one who had suggested that Dylan see his medical ID bracelet as something powerful rather than scary. "So today," Dylan said, straightening his thin shoulders with determination, "we're going to use our armor to make this important man understand the truth." They continued walking through the perfectly planned streets of Palo Alto, passing cafes where young executives discussed initial acquisitions worth millions of dollars, through clothing stores where a single piece cost more than Maria's monthly rent, past luxury cars parked casually as if they were bicycles. "Mommy," Dylan said when they spotted the glass, and steel building of Thompson and Associates rising in the distance, "you promise me you won't cry when you talk to him?" "Sometimes adults don't listen when you're crying." Maria stopped again, impressed by her son's insight. "How did you get so wise, little one?" Dylan shrugged, a surprisingly mature gesture. "Hospitals have lots of adults crying. I learned that sometimes you have to be strong first, then you can cry when you're safe at home." They arrived at the corporate building at 8:15 in the morning, rush hour when hurried executives came and went like ants in a busy anthill. Maria felt her stomach tighten when she saw the imposing facade just 2 days ago. She had left that place in tears, escorted like a criminal. The main entrance was a monument to power and wealth, Italian marble, water fountains that whispered softly, contemporary art that probably cost more than Maria earned in a decade. Dylan observed everything with wide eyes, his little hand gripping Maria's even tighter. As they approached the revolving doors, 2 security guards, the same middle-aged black man and his younger partner who had escorted Maria 2 days before, immediately went on alert. "Miss Rodriguez," the older guard said, and Maria could hear genuine discomfort in his voice. "I'm afraid you cannot enter. There is a specific order from Mr. Thompson." "Please," Maria interrupted, her voice firm but respectful. "I just need 5 minutes to talk to him. 5 minutes to explain the truth." The youngest guard, a blond man of about 25 with blue eyes that still showed traces of compassion that corporate life had not completely extinguished, looked at Dylan and hesitated. The child was standing beside Maria, his big dark eyes pleading, the hospital bracelet shining under the lobby lights like a small beacon of vulnerability. "Please, senor," Dylan said with his small but clear voice, addressing the young guard. "My mommy is not a bad person. She just needs to tell the truth." The older guard sighed deeply, his eyes moving between Maria and Dylan. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I have specific orders." "Marcus," said the younger guard, touching his colleague's arm. "Just 5 minutes. Look at this child." His voice lowered to an urgent whisper. "What harm could it do? If she causes any trouble, we'll get her out of there immediately." Marcus studied Maria's pleading face, then looked at Dylan, who had stepped closer and was now holding his mother's hand with both his thin little hands. Something in his expression softened. Perhaps he was a father, Or maybe he simply retained a shred of humanity that 2 years working in corporate security hadn't managed to erase. 5 minutes? He finally murmured. But if Mr. Thompson wants to call the police, there's nothing I can do to stop it. Maria nodded quickly, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you. Thank you so much. They walked through the marble lobby, Maria's nervous footsteps echoing on the polished floor while Dylan walked beside her, his worn sneakers making little noise. The executive elevator rose silently through the floors, each number flashing on the display, making Maria's heart beat faster. On the 16th floor, the sound of male voices speaking in professional, confident tones leaked through the frosted glass doors of the main boardroom. Maria took a deep breath, adjusted the simple blouse she had chosen so carefully that morning, and gently pushed Dylan behind her. "Stay close to me, okay, sweetheart?" she whispered. "No matter what happens, you stay with me." Dylan nodded solemnly, his small hand gripping firmly the back of Maria's skirt. With her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum, Maria gently knocked on the glass door and, without waiting for a response, opened it. The Thompson and Associates boardroom was a sanctuary of power and money. A mahogany table the size of a canoe dominated the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than Maria's used car. Video conferencing panels covered an entire wall, while a spectacular view of Silicon Valley stretched through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard Thompson sat at the head of the table, wearing a charcoal gray suit impeccably tailored that emphasized his cold eyes. Around the table, 5 middle-aged men in expensive suits and serious expressions stern to look at the intrusion. Documents, tablets, and fine porcelain coffee cups were scattered across the table. Evidence of an important meeting interrupted. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard lifted his eyes from the papers he was reviewing, and when he saw Maria standing at the door with Dylan beside her, his expression changed from surprise to uncontrolled fury in seconds. "How dare you come in here?" His voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Security!" "Please, Mr. Thompson," Maria began, stepping forward, her voice trembling but determined. "I just need a minute to explain. I didn't steal your laptop. I would never do such a thing." The investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances. One of them, an Asian man with graying hair, whispered something to the colleague next to him. Richard stood abruptly, his chair spinning back with the force of the movement. "You are a criminal," he said, his voice rising. "A thief who had the audacity to violate my office and now shamelessly interrupts an important business meeting." "I'm not a criminal," Maria said, her voice strengthening. "I worked for you for 5 years. 5 years cleaning your offices, respecting your things, never taking even a paperclip that wasn't mine." "Liar," Richard spat the words. "You had access to my office. You were the only person there that night. The evidence is clear." One of the investors cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Richard, maybe we should—" "No," Richard cut off, his eyes never leaving Maria with icy disdain. "This woman needs to learn that actions have consequences." He pointed an accusing finger at her. "You didn't just steal from me. But now, you're disrupting a $15 million business meeting. You're trying to emotionally blackmail me by bringing a child here." Richard's words hit Maria like physical blows. She felt her legs weaken but forced herself to remain standing. "I didn't bring my son to blackmail anyone. I brought him because he needs to understand that sometimes you have to fight for the truth, even when powerful people don't want to listen." "Your truth is a lie," Richard roared. "And now you're using a child as a shield for your pathetic manipulations. What kind of mother does that?" Dylan, who had remained silent behind Maria, took a small step forward. The boy was pale, his large eyes full of fear, but something in his posture radiated courage that seemed impossible for someone so young and fragile. "Please, sir," Dylan said, his small but clear voice cutting through the tension in the room. "My mommy doesn't lie. She is the most honest person in the whole world." Richard looked down, seeing Dylan for the first time as something more than an accessory to Maria's performance. The boy was clearly sick as skin, had that translucent pallor characteristic of chemotherapy treatments, and his extreme thinness was evident even through the Spider-Man t-shirt hanging loosely on his small shoulders. For a moment, something like surprise passed through Richard's cold eyes, but quickly his expression hardened again. "I don't care what emotional trick you're trying to use," he said to Maria, though his eyes remained fixed on Dylan. Criminals often use children to gain sympathy. That is even more despicable. Dylan took another step forward, completely leaving the protection of his mother's skirt. His little hands. Dylan took another step forward, completely stepping out from under his mother's skirt. His small, pale hands held the hospital bracelet as if it were a sacred shield, and he raised it toward Richard, with the desperate innocence of a child who still believed adults could be reasonable if only they saw the truth. "Look," Dylan said, his voice fragile but determined. "This bracelet protects me. Dr. Martinez said that as long as I wear this, it means I'm strong enough to fight against anything bad." "Mommy isn't bad, sir. She fights for me every day." Richard looked at the child with growing irritation. The boy was interfering with his display of authority in front of the investors, turning what should have been a quick and efficient expulsion into an uncomfortable emotional spectacle. The 5 men around the table watched the scene with expressions ranging from curiosity to obvious discomfort. "I don't have time for childish games," Richard said brusquely, reaching out to grab the bracelet. His intention was simply to return it quickly to the boy and end this embarrassing farce. "Here, take this back and—" His words died in his throat. The white plastic bracelet swung between his fingers, and the black letters printed on the shiny material glowed under the LED lights of the boardroom like an accusation. His brain processed the information in slow motion, each letter engraving itself in his mind like fire. Dylan Thompson Dobb. The 15th of March 2016 allergy, penicillin diagnosis. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Richard Thompson's world collapsed in a matter of seconds. His eyes widened, fixing on the name printed on the bracelet as if the letters were indecipherable hieroglyphs. Dylan Thompson. Thompson. Not Rodriguez. Thompson. His legs buckled, and he leaned heavily on the mahogany table, his free hand instinctively going to his chest, where his heart pounded hard enough to make him think he was having a heart attack. The investors around the table began murmuring concerns, but their voices reached him like distant echoes in a tunnel. Memories hit him like an unrelenting avalanche. 8 years ago, Sarah Martinez, never Rodriguez, always Martinez. Dark hair, deep brown eyes, a shy smile that had drawn him during that conference in San Francisco. She worked serving canapés at the event, but when they talked during a break, there was something about Hera's sharp intelligence, a natural dignity that intrigued him. 3 months of secret meetings. Richard had never introduced her to his social circles, never taken her to the expensive restaurants where he was known. She was his escape, his affair with someone who belonged to a completely different world than his own. Then came that phone call. Sarah's voice trembling on the other end of the line. "Richard, I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. He remembered looking out the window of his office at the busy streets of Palo Alto, quickly calculating how this situation might affect his reputation, his business, his carefully laid plans. "This is a problem that can be solved," he had said with his usual coldness. "I'll pay for the solution, and you disappear from my life. $50,000. Enough for you to start over anywhere you want." Sarah's gasping breath on the other end of the line. You're asking me to abort our baby?" "I'm offering a practical solution to an inconvenient problem," he had replied. "You have 24 hours to decide." The next day, Sarah called again. Her voice was different, stronger, but also broken by something Richard couldn't identify at the time. "I'm not going to abort my child," she said. "But I accept the money to disappear from your life. You will never see me or hear from me again." Richard had sent the check through his lawyers. He never thought about Sarah Martinez again. She became just another successful business transaction. But now Sarah was standing before him, no longer the 26-year-old woman he had dismissed as an inconvenient problem. She was Maria Rodriguez, not Martinez. She must have gotten married, taken her husband's name, built a completely new life. And all this time, she had raised alone the child who was his. Richard looked at Dylan with completely different eyes. The boy's features crystallized before him like a puzzle suddenly fitting together. The dark eyes were Sarah's, but the shape of the face, the jawline, even sick and thin, were unmistakably familiar. It was like looking at a miniature, weakened version of himself. "My God," he whispered, the bracelet shaking violently in his hands. Dylan watched him with that hopeful expression only children can keep, even in the face of adult cruelty. "Will you help my mommy now? Did you see my lucky bracelet?" The irony of the situation hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. For minutes, he had been shouting at the mother of his own child, humiliating her in front of strangers, threatening to call the police on a woman who had raised alone the child he had rejected even before he was born. Maria looked at Richard with growing confusion and alarm. She could see that something fundamental had changed in his expression, but she couldn't understand what. The transformation had been too quick, too radical to make sense. "Mr. Thompson?" she said hesitantly. "Are you okay?" Richard couldn't speak. His throat had completely closed. The investors began to rise from their chairs, clearly realizing something extraordinary was happening, though they couldn't grasp exactly what. "Richard," said the Asian investor, gently touching his arm, "you need to sit down. You're extremely pale." But Richard couldn't take his eyes off Dylan. His son was right in front of him, sick, fragile, fighting leukemia, and all these years he hadn't even known the child existed. The hospital bracelet kept trembling in his hands like a leaf in the wind, and the words printed on it seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Dylan Thompson. His last name. His blood. His responsibility. His redemption or his condemnation. The hospital wristband kept trembling in Richard's hands, as if it had a life of its own. Each letter of the name, DYLANTHOMPSON, pulsed before his eyes like an accusatory neon sign. The air in the boardroom seemed to grow denser, harder to breathe. His Italian silk tie, which had always been a symbol of his impeccable control, now felt like a rope tightening around his neck. I can't breathe," he whispered, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. His legs gave way and he staggered backward, hitting the leather chairs scattered across the floor with dull thuds. His free hand went to his chest, where he felt as if a 1,000-pound weight was crushing his lungs. Cold sweat began to run down his forehead, staining the Egyptian silk shirt he had chosen so carefully that morning. "Richard!" The Asian investor stood up quickly, his chair creaking against the wooden floor. "Someone call an ambulance. Now!" But Richard could barely hear the voices around him. Everything became a distant, muffled echo, as if he were submerged in murky water. His memories began to flow like a high-speed film, fragmented images crashing in his mind like shards of glass. Sarah standing at the door of his office 8 years ago. Her face was pale, but her brown eyes shone with a determination he had underestimated. "You can't force me to get rid of this child, Richard. You can't." He had risen from behind the mahogany desk, his hands clasped behind his back like a general preparing for battle. "Sarah, you don't understand the gravity of the situation. I have a reputation to uphold. Investors who trust my image of stability. An illegitimate child would be problematic." "Problematic?" Her voice had cracked slightly. "We're talking about a human life, Richard. Your child." "He's not my child if I don't acknowledge him," he had replied with the coldness that had become his trademark. "And I can assure you won't be able to prove anything in court. My lawyers are very good at what they do." Sarah had recoiled as if he had slapped her. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm being practical. Take the money. Disappear. Rebuild your life somewhere else. Because if you try to extort me or tarnish my reputation, I guarantee you won't get a single cent of what I'm offering now." Richard leaned over the conference table, his hands trembling violently as he tried to hold himself together. The irony of the situation hit him like a sledgehammer. He, Richard Thompson, the man who prided himself on never making mistakes, who had built an empire based on precise decisions and exact calculations, had just found out he was punishing his own son, Dylan. His son had leukemia. He was fighting for his life while the father had humiliated and fired the boy's mother for a crime she had not committed. The woman who had raised the boy alone, whom he had rejected before he was even born, was being destroyed by his arrogance and prejudice. Sir, are you okay?" Dylan's small voice cut through the fog enveloping Richard's mind. The boy had approached hesitantly, his dark eyes so much like Sarah's full of genuine concern. It was impossible. Incomprehensible. The child he had just publicly disrespected was trying to help him. "Mommy, what's wrong with him?" Dylan asked, looking at Maria with confusion and fear. "Is he sick like me?" Maria stood frozen in the middle of the room, watching Richard's collapse with a mixture of surprise and terror. She couldn't understand what had caused that radical transformation. A minute before, he was the arrogant predator humiliating her in front of investors. Now, he looked like a broken man, destroyed by some internal revelation. "Dylan, come here," she said softly, reaching out to her son. "Don't get close to him." But Dylan, with the natural compassion of a child who had spent too much time in hospitals, ignored his mother's call. He moved closer to Richard, his small hand gently touching the trembling man's arm. "My name is Dylan," he said softly. "When I get very scared in the hospital, Dr. Martinez teaches me to breathe slowly. Do you want me to teach you?" The child's words struck Richard like daggers. His own son, was trying to comfort him, offering a gentle kindness he had never shown anyone in his adult life. More fragmented memories flooded his mind. Sarah leaving his office for the last time, her protective hands on the still unseen belly. "You'll never see me again, Richard. But one day, when you're old and alone, you'll regret choosing money over love. Love is a weakness successful men can't afford," he had replied, but his words sounded empty even to himself. "Then I hope your success keeps you warm at night," were the last words Sarah had said before disappearing from his life. Richard tried to speak, tried to say something to Dylan, but his throat was completely closed. Tears began to stream down his face, staining his expensive shirt. He hadn't cried in decades, not since he had decided emotions were incompatible with success. The investors moved nervously around the table, some speaking on cell phones, others just watching the collapse of the man who, just minutes before, had been the confident corporate predator. The sound of sirens began to echo on the streets below, growing louder until it was impossible to ignore. Paramedics entered the room like a tornado of blue uniforms and medical equipment, soon followed by security guards trying to control the situation. "Sir, I need you to tell me where it hurts," said one of the paramedics, a middle-aged man with gray hair and practiced hands. "Are you having chest pain?" Richard nodded weakly, his hand still gripping the hospital wristband as if it were a precious relic. As the paramedics began checking his vital signs and connecting him to equipment, he managed to articulate only one word, repeating it like a mantra. "Dylan, Dylan, Dylan." The paramedics exchanged worried glances, interpreting the repetition as a sign of mental confusion resulting from stress. "What is your full name, sir?" asked the younger paramedic. The private room at Stanford Hospital was a sanctuary of silence and filtered light, very different from the boardroom where Richard had collapsed 3 days earlier. Sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, wearing a light blue robe that cost less than his ties, he watched the constant movement of nurses and doctors through the glass window. For the first time in decades, Richard Thompson was not in complete control of his life. The doctors had diagnosed a severe anxiety attack combined with extreme exhaustion, not a heart attack, as he had feared, but an emotional breakdown that forced his body into a full stop. Now, with his mind clearer, thanks to the mild sedatives still in his system, Richard could process the magnitude of what he had discovered. Dylan was his son. His own flesh and blood was dying of leukemia while he, the father, had destroyed the family's only source of income over a false accusation. His first call, even before the doctors allowed phone use, was to Marcus Webb, the most expensive and discreet private investigator on the West Coast. Marcus was a former LAPD detective who had built a lucrative career solving embarrassing problems for powerful men. If there was anything to find out about the missing laptop, Marcus would find it. "I want to know everything," Richard had said with a still, hoarse voice. "Every person who had access to my office in the last 2 weeks. Every move, every opportunity. And I want security camera footage from all floors, not just mine. I don't care how much it costs." The second call was even harder. He asked Marcus to investigate Maria Rodriguez's note to incriminate her, but to understand the life of the woman and child he had abandoned. "I want to know how they lived these last 7 years, he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Every detail, where they lived, where she worked, how they paid the medical bills. Everything." Marcus, with his 30 years of experience reading between the lines of wealthy clients' requests, asked no questions. "I need 48 hours for the laptop case, and maybe a week for the full report on the Rodriguez family." 48 hours later, Marcus entered the temporary office Richard had set up in his Palo Alto home. The investigator carried a brown leather folder that looked very heavy for his size. "You won't like what I found," Marcus said without preamble, opening the folder on Richard's crystal dining table. The first photographs he pulled out showed James Mitchell, the vice president of technological development at Thompson & Associates, coming in and out of a cafe in downtown San Jose during working hours. In the next photos, James was passing an envelope to an Asian man in a dark suit. James Mitchell has gambling debts amounting to $300,000, Marcus explained, his voice professional and unemotional. He has been selling confidential information from your company to Technova Solutions for at least 6 months. The missing laptop contained the original files of the negotiations with Japanese investors' information worth millions to the right competitors. Richard studied the photographs with growing fury. And Maria Rodriguez? Marcus flipped through some pages in the report. She was the perfect bait. A low-level employee, an immigrant with no means to defend herself legally. Mitchell knew you would suspect her immediately. He planted evidence in her locker fake fingerprints on the laptop's network cable, which he later removed before the official investigation. The anger Richard felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was not the cold, calculated fury he used in business, but something primitive and protective that surprised him with its intensity. "Where is the evidence?" he asked. Marcus pulled out a USB drive from the folder. "Security camera recordings the building management forgot to check. Mitchell entering your office on Tuesday morning before you arrived. You can clearly see him taking the laptop and putting it in his briefcase." Richard took the drive as if it were a weapon. James Mitchell had not only stolen from him, but had consciously destroyed the life of an innocent family to cover his tracks. The injustice of the situation made him nauseous. "And what about the other investigation?" Richard asked. Though part of him feared the answers, Marcus sighed deeply. This was clearly the hardest part of his report. He took out a stack of documents from the second folder. Maria Santos Rodriguez, 34 years old, came to the United States at 19 on a student visa, graduated in business administration from San Jose State University with excellent grades, worked as a waitress during college to pay for her studies. Richard vaguely remembered Sarah mentioning she was studying, but he had never really paid attention to the details of her life. Marcus continued, flipping pages of documents. After the breakup, she married Carlos Rodriguez in 2017, a marriage that lasted only 8 months. He abandoned her when he found out she was pregnant by another man. Guilt hit Richard like a stab. Indirectly, he had destroyed even Maria's chance to form a stable family. Since then, Marcus went on, she has worked 3 jobs simultaneously to support Dylan and pay for his medical treatments. Night cleaning at Thompson & Associates, house cleaning on weekends, and part-time work at a laundry during afternoons. 19 hours of work per day, 6 days a week. Richard felt as if all the air had been taken out of his lungs. 19 hours a day? And never at any point during these 7 years did she mention Dylan's father's name to doctors, social workers, or anyone in authority. When asked, she always just said, "The father is not in their lives." Marcus pulled out another set of documents. "These are the medical bills, Richard. You need to see this." The papers Marcus placed before Richard were a devastating progression of numbers and dates. Stanford Children's Hospital, Pediatric Oncology. The amounts made his eyes water not for the financial magnitude, but for what they represented in terms of human sacrifice. Dylan was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia at 5 years old, Marcus explained. It's an aggressive but treatable form if caught early. The costs, well, you can see. Richard saw. Every line of the medical reports told a story of a mother fighting the impossible. Chemotherapy bills amounting to $4,000 monthly. Experimental drugs costing more than new cars. Emergency hospitalizations resulting in bills of $20,000. How did she manage to pay for all this? He asked, though he already knew the heartbreaking answer. Payment plans that consumed 80% of her income. She lived on less than $400 a month after paying medical bills. Charity donations from the local church. Free food lines twice a week. The 2-bedroom apartment on Tully Road had never seemed as intimidating as it did that Friday afternoon. Richard stood frozen before the peeling brown door for a full 15 minutes, his right hand gripping a leather folder containing evidence of Maria's innocence, while his left hand trembled at his side as if it had a life of its own. During the 5 days since leaving the hospital, he had mentally rehearsed this conversation hundreds of times. In the marble walls of his mansion, during the silent curves of his Tesla, through sleepless nights watching the glass ceiling of the bedroom each time, imagining different scenarios, different words, different reactions. But now, confronted with the raw reality of that dimly lit hallway smelling of cleaning products and homemade food, all his prepared words vanished. He could hear soft sounds coming from inside the apartment, the low murmur of a television, perhaps a cartoon, and occasionally Maria's melodious voice speaking in Spanish. Gentle words, maternal tones he had never experienced in his own privileged but emotionally barren childhood. Finally, gathering all the courage he had used to close million-dollar deals, Richard knocked on the door. The internal sounds stopped immediately. Light footsteps approached, and Richard heard Maria's cautious voice on the other side of the wood. "Kines. Maria, it's Richard Thompson." His voice came out weaker than intended. "I need to talk to you. It's important." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard could imagine Maria on the other side, debating whether to call the police or simply ignore him until he left. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a mix of fear and defiance. "I have nothing to say to you. Please go away. Maria, please, I have proof. Proof that you didn't steal the laptop. I know who really did, and I need to apologize." Another long silence. Then, slowly, Richard heard multiple locks being opened. The door cracked open just a sliver, held by a security chain, and Maria's face appeared in the gap. Her eyes were red and swollen, as if she had been crying for days. "What kind of proof?" she asked, her voice suspicious. Richard lifted the folder. "Security camera recordings, financial documents, the real culprit's name. Maria, I made a terrible mistake." Maria studied him for a long moment, her dark brown eyes trying to read his intentions. Finally, she closed the door, removed the chain, and opened it again. The apartment was exactly what Richard had imagined based on Marcus's report, but seeing it in person was like a punch to the gut. It was tiny but impeccably clean, with second-hand furniture that had been lovingly cared for. Photos of Dylan smiling, some clearly taken during times when he wasn't sick, covered every available surface. The smell of chicken soup floated from the small kitchen. Dylan was lying on the couch, covered by a colorful handmade blanket, watching a cartoon on a small television that had clearly seen better days. When he saw Richard enter, his eyes widened with surprise and recognition. "He's the important man from the office," he said, with the simple honesty of children. "Hi, are you feeling better? You got sick like me at the office." Richard's heart broke. His first real interaction with his own son, and the child was worried about his well-being. I'm feeling better, thanks," Richard managed to say, his voice choking. Maria gestured stiffly toward a simple chair near the tiny kitchen table. "Sit down. 5 minutes. Then I want you to leave." Richard carefully sat down in the wooden chair, which creaked under his weight. He placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing prints of the security recordings, bank documents, and detailed reports on James Mitchell. "James Mitchell, my vice president of development, stole the laptop," he began, his voice gaining strength. "He was selling confidential company information and needed a scapegoat. You were chosen because he knew I would suspect you immediately." Maria took the photos with trembling hands, studying the images of James entering Richard's office with a folder, leaving without it. Dates and times were clearly marked. "These cameras, why didn't anyone check these cameras when I begged?" Her voice was rising in volume and intensity. "I said there were other cameras. I said I could prove my innocence." "Because I didn't want to hear," Richard admitted, the truth coming out like a confession in church. "Because it was easier to blame someone who had no power to defend herself than to investigate properly. Because I was an arrogant and prejudiced man who judged people by social status instead of character." Tears began to stream down Maria's face as she absorbed the magnitude of the injustice she had suffered. 5 years, she whispered. 5 years working for you, respecting you, and you humiliated me in front of all those men for something I never did." "I know," Richard said, his own tears starting to fall. "And that's not even the worst thing I did do you." Maria looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Richard took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. "Maria, do you remember me from before you worked at my company? From 8 years ago?" Maria's confused expression slowly turned into something like recognition and then horror. Her skin visibly paled. "No, it can't be." "Sarah Martinez," Richard said softly. "You changed your name when you married Carlos Rodriguez, but 8 years ago you were Sarah Martinez. And I am Dylan's father." The silence in the apartment was absolute. Even the television seemed to lower its volume. Maria stared at him with wide eyes, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No." She stood up so quickly that the chair fell backward, banging against the linoleum floor with a crash that made Dylan sit upright on the sofa, alarmed. "Mommy, what's happening?" Dylan asked, his voice small and scared. Maria began pacing around the small room, her hands in her hair. You can't be. After all these years, after everything you made me go through. Maria, please." "No!" she screamed.
Tension filled the hallway as Maria studied every word about the evidence. She sat firmly on the sofa and wiped her eyes. Now the truth was there, raw and matched with her 5 years of silence. "Why?" she started, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you look sooner?" Richard looked at her, his eyes drilling into hers as if searching for redemption in her gaze. "Because it was easier to keep control than to admit my failure," he admitted, his voice faltering. "Because my own fears made me forget about justice." The photographs spoke. James's face emerged clearly on the paper. The truth was harsh, brutal, but it was a start. Maria, cold and steady, returned to the papers. "The footage," she said. "Show me where he takes the laptop." Richard inserted the USB drive. The three watched in silence as the recording confirmed it. James sneaking out without the damn laptop. Maria took a deep breath. All those nights filled with silence and fear suddenly seemed to be tempered by justice. She looked at Richard, who now looked at her with different eyes. 6 years, she said. 6 years of unheard words. And he sighed as if dropping a heavy weight. I will make up for every day we stole from you, from both of you. Her expression softened. I don't want charity, she said. I want this to change. For me. For Dylan. Richard nodded, feeling a burden lift. We will rebuild. Not just your reputation, but both of your lives. Maria stood and extended her hand. Richard shook it, a silent pact in the modest room that for the first time held the acknowledgement of his humiliation and the first step toward making things right.
6 months after the confession that had changed their lives forever, the morning of the inauguration of Dylan's Hope Children's Hospital dawned with a light blue sky that seemed to bless the historic moment. Richard stood in front of the 4-story building in San Jose, watching the final preparations while feeling an inner peace he had never experienced in his 45 years of life. The hospital was not as ostentatious as his former corporate offices. It had been designed with soft colors and organic shapes that welcomed rather than intimidated. Large windows allowed natural light to flood every corridor, and therapeutic gardens dotted the landscape, creating an environment of genuine healing. Every detail had been thought through the eyes of a child who needed hope as much as medicine. Dad, are you nervous? Dylan's voice interrupted his thoughts. His son, it was still miraculous to be able to use those words, ran up to him wearing a light blue shirt that Maria had specially chosen for the occasion. Dylan's brown hair had grown back after the final months of chemotherapy, and his eyes shone with the vitality of a child who had won an impossible battle. A little, Richard admitted, kneeling to be at eye level with Dylan. But it's a good nervous. How did you feel before finishing your last treatment? Dylan considered the question with the seriousness he had developed during his years facing the illness. Scared but excited at the same time, like something really important was about to happen. Exactly like that, Richard smiled, kissing his son's forehead. Are you feeling strong today? Super strong, Dylan responded, flexing his thin but increasingly strong little arms. Dr. Martinez said my tests are perfect. 0 bad cells in my blood. Complete remission had come 3 months earlier, a milestone Richard had celebrated by crying tears of joy in the bathroom of their modest rented house in San Jose. The $20 million mansion in Palo Alto, the luxury cars, the investment properties all had been sold to finance the hospital's construction and create an endowment fund that would guarantee its operation for decades. Maria appeared beside them, and Richard felt the familiar warmth that now accompanied every moment he saw the woman he had truly learned to love. The reconciliation process had been slow and sometimes painful. Months of difficult conversations, family therapy, and moments of doubt when the magnitude of his initial betrayal seemed impossible to overcome. But they had built something new on the ruins of the past, not just for Dylan's sake, but because they had discovered a genuine connection that transcended their mistakes. "The families are arriving," Maria said, pointing to the parking lot where various families with children in wheelchairs, with colorful bandanas covering heads carelessly missing hair, or holding the hands of small siblings converged toward the hospital. Richard watched each family, knowing that behind every face was a story of sleepless nights, financial desperation, and love that refused to give up. These were the families he had decided to serve for the rest of his life. "Mr. Thompson?" A small voice called his attention. A girl of perhaps 6 years old, wearing a bright pink wig over her bald head, approached timidly with her mother. "Hello, my love," Richard responded in basic Spanish he had been learning. He knelt down to her level. "What's your name?" "Isabella," she whispered, then louder. "Mom said you built this hospital because your son got sick like me. Is it true?" Richard looked at Dylan, who nodded encouragingly. "It's true, Isabella. My son Dylan had leukemia, just like you. And now he is healthy and strong because he received good medical care. That's what we want for you, too." Isabella smiled, revealing missing front teeth that made her look even more precious. "Can I be friends with Dylan?" "Of course you can," Dylan answered before Richard could respond. "Do you want me to show you the playground? There are swings and slides even inside the hospital." The two children ran together toward the hospital entrance, and Richard felt his heart expand with a joy that no amount of corporate success had ever provided. The inauguration ceremony began at 10 a.m. Hundreds of people gathered in the courtyard specially designed for events like this. Current and former patients, families, medical staff from all over the region, government officials, and community representatives formed a sea of hopeful faces. Dr. Elena Martinez, who had accepted the position of chief pediatric oncologist of the new hospital, took the podium first. "Today we celebrate more than the opening of a new medical facility," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Today we celebrate proof that love can transform tragedy into hope, that one person's healing process can become healing for an entire community." When it was Richard's turn to speak, he walked to the podium carrying a letter he had received the previous week. His voice trembled slightly as he began. 6 months ago, I was a man who believed that success was measured only in dollars in bank accounts and power over others. I had constructed my life on a foundation of selfishness and fear, sacrificing everything meaningful to maintain an image of perfection that ultimately meant nothing. He paused, looking at Maria and Dylan in the front row. Then I discovered that my arrogance and prejudice had nearly destroyed what mattered most in the world, my own family. And more importantly, I discovered that my journey toward redemption could only begin when I stopped thinking about myself and started thinking about how to serve others. Richard unfolded the letter. "Yesterday, I received this letter from the Gonzalez family. Their 3-year-old daughter, Carmen, was diagnosed with a brain tumor 2 weeks ago. With our help, she started treatment immediately, without the family having to choose between medical care and keeping their house." His voice broke slightly as he continued reading. "Dear Mr. Thompson, we can never thank you enough for giving our little girl a chance to live. When doctors at other hospitals told us that treatment would cost more than our house is worth, we thought we had lost our baby. Now, because of your hospital, Carmen is fighting, and we have hope again. You gave us back our future." By this point, Richard was not the only one crying. Families throughout the crowd were holding each other, understanding that this hospital represented possibility where there had seemed only the impossible. "This hospital exists because my son Dylan taught me that love is not weakness," Richard continued. "It is the only thing that can truly change the world. And while I cannot change past mistakes, I can ensure that other families never have to choose between love and financial survival when fighting for their children's lives." The moment for the ribbon cutting arrived. Dylan, wearing a small hard hat that made him look like a miniature construction worker, stood between Richard and Maria, each holding one side of the large golden scissors. Behind them, dozens of other children who would be among the first patients formed a colorful line of hope. "Ready, mijo?" Maria asked Dylan. "Ready," Dylan responded, then looked up at Richard. "Ready, Dad?" "Ready," Richard said, and together they cut the blue and white ribbon. The crowd erupted in applause and tears. Children began running toward the entrance, eager to explore their new hospital. Parents wiped away tears while talking excitedly about upcoming treatments that no longer seemed fiscally impossible. Medical staff stood proudly, knowing they would now work in an environment dedicated purely to healing instead of profit. Inside, the hospital was even more breathtaking. Child-height water fountains featured colorful fish swimming in clear tubes. Walls were painted with murals depicting adventures and stories that could transport young patients to magical worlds during difficult treatments. Playing areas were integrated throughout, recognizing that healing required joy alongside medicine. Dylan immediately appointed himself as unofficial tour guide, leading groups of children through the corridors while explaining everything with the enthusiasm of someone who had contributed to the hospital's creation. Richard and Maria followed, watching their son transform from patient to healer. In the pediatric oncology wing, Dylan paused in front of a room where a little boy about his age was sitting alone in a blue armchair, holding a worn teddy bear in his arms. His eyes were tired but curious. Dylan smiled and gently knocked on the glass door. "Hi," he said, opening slowly. "Want to see where the giant aquarium is?" The little fish looked like spaceships swimming. The boy hesitated for a second, then slowly nodded. Dylan held out his hand, and without saying a word, the little patient stood and took it. Maria and Richard, standing at the end of the corridor, watched the scene in silence. The morning sun filtered through the windows, bathing the two boys with a soft golden light. At that moment, Richard knew that although he could not erase the past, he had created something that would touch the future of thousands of children. And in that hospital built with love, hope was not just a name, it was a living reality, walking hand in hand through the corridors.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.